Chapter 18. Lisa's persistent practicing was an inspiration for the others. In the fall, Edith enrolled in a shorthand course, determined as well to make something of herself. Gunther begged his boss, Mr. Steinberg, to make good on his statement that he was crucial to the war effort, and received a promotion to the accounting department. Hans enrolled in a course to become a physical therapist and brought home Braille anatomy books to study. And Johnny wrote more and more poetry, declaring that Lisa's music had convinced him to become a writer after the war. Only Aaron, it seemed to Lisa, didn't join in the hard work brigade. He showed up late several times a week and had to throw pebbles at the third-floor window so Gunther would come down and let him in. Though it was the constant threat of the bombings. The headlines would scream 1,000 dead in one hellish night. Then, the next day, the retaliation. RAF flyboys better than the Ruhr. Back and forth the destruction went. In the midst of the chaos, Lisa kept to her disciplined schedule, practicing and practicing. She dedicated the next 2 months to sight reading and fundamentals. Every night after a long day at the factory, Lisa would hurry through her afternoon practice and, after a quick dinner, go back to the basement for the dreaded hour of instruction. Hans was in charge of sight reading. Since he had memorized every note of his own sheet music, he would instruct Aaron to choose a piece that Lisa hadn't seen before, but that he knew perfectly. All right, look at the key signature and think ahead one measure. Ready? Go! Hans clapped his hands once, and off she went. Pretty funny, huh? A blind guy teaching you sight reading, Hans yelled over the music. Music theory was Aaron's bailiwick. He finally admitted to Lisa that he had studied the violin in Mannheim and had learned the basics of dominants, subdominants, and chord inversions. Science came easily to him, and he patently digested and explained the principles of harmony. I wish I had known that before, she marveled. They would lie together on the couch in the living room, Glenn Miller blaring from the Victrola, and she would guess her way through the chord changes as the swing music filled the air. Solfeggio was a trial for everyone. Lisa's singing voice wasn't particularly inspiring, and do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do wasn't a very pleasing tune. On behalf of the entire hostel, Edith finally insisted that do, re, mi be the basement-only activity. One day, unexpectedly, Gina arrived at the hostel. "I'm back," was all she said in explanation, and took off chatting as much as always. She had managed to get a job as a beautician and gave up her nanny job in Richmond to return to her friends at 243 Willesden Lane. They were all glad to see her, especially Gunther, who walked around with a moony grin for days. Gina confided in Lisa that Gunther's smile made combing strangers' hair worth the step down in status. In no time, the two girlfriends were back, sharing late-night confidences about life and love. Most night, Gina lay face up on the bed, smiling from ear to ear, while Lisa was coiled on her side, lamenting Aaron's ornery streak. His attitude problem had gotten worse. One evening, the argument between Mrs. Cohen and Aaron was particularly heated. Whether it was the new edict she had received from Bloomsbury about stricter rules for curfew or Aaron's insolent attitude, her patience had finally run out. "If you come back after curfew, you're not to come back at all." "Fine, have it your way," Aaron said, and went to the basement to let off steam. He tried to get Lisa's sympathy to no avail. "Mrs. Cohen is right, you idiot. You've got to be more serious. You're always fooling around," Lisa lectured. "You're sounding awfully high and mighty," Aaron said, and turned and walked out. Lisa went back to practicing, but after a few minutes found herself filled with regret and ran upstairs to the living room to find Aaron and apologize. He was nowhere to be found, so she turned to the basement and her Bach. The next day, Lisa was devastated when Aaron still had not returned. Lisa lay on her bed, contrite and worried. "It's all my fault," she moaned. Gina looked on. "Don't worry. He used to do this a lot of times before you came. He'll be back." But Aaron didn't come back that next night or the night after. Lisa lay in her bed at the call for lights out, her body racked by coughing. "Maybe you should stop practicing for a while, Lisa. It's too cold down there," Gina suggested, concerned. "It's just a cough. It'll go away. Don't worry." "If it doesn't go away soon, we won't get any sleep," Gina said, only half joking. On the third night, the telephone in the hallway rang, and the girls heard Mrs. Cohen's footsteps on the stairs. "Lisa," the matron called, "it's Aaron Lewin on the telephone." Lisa jumped up and ran downstairs, grabbing the receiver. "Aaron? Aaron, are you all right?" Gina crept down the stairs and listened to her friend as she clutched the telephone to her ear. "What? For how long?" Lisa cried out in alarm. Wait, don't hang up. Aaron, Aaron!" she shouted. The receiver went dead in her hand. "He only had a 1-minute call," she said in disbelief to the matron and Gina as they approached. "What happened?" they asked in unison. "Aaron's been arrested and sent to the Isle of Man as an alien." "Oh, my God. For how long?" Gina asked. "I don't know," Lisa stammered. Mrs. Cohen took the receiver and hung it back on the hook. "It was bound to happen to him sooner or later. You have to admit he was asking for it." As tears sprang to Lisa's eyes, Mrs. Cohen put her arm around the distraught teenager. "It won't be forever. Now go upstairs, dear. Try and get some sleep." Lisa disentangled herself from Mrs. Cohen's awkward embrace, ran up the staircase, and threw herself on the covers of her ice-cold bed. Her sobs turned into a fit of coughing. Gina stood over her friend, worried. "Why don't I see if Mrs. Cohen could make you some hot water and lemon or something?" "He doesn't deserve it. Why would he deserve it? She must hate him." "She didn't mean anything. Of course he doesn't deserve it. It's all my fault." "Why is it your fault? Lots of boys are getting picked up. Look at Paul," Gina said with as much sympathy as she could muster at that time of night. Lisa kept mumbling to herself, not listening. "It's all my fault. If only I hadn't been so mean, he wouldn't have left." "It's not your fault. And besides, Paul said it wasn't so bad in the camp, remember?" Gina added. "What do you know about it?" Lisa exploded, jumping out of bed and slamming the door behind her. How is she going to live without Aaron? December was miserable for Lisa. She practiced as hard as ever, but the relentless cold had no warm embrace at the end of the evening. Aaron sent several postcards apologizing for being so careless, but his brief words made her miss him even more. Lisa's cough got worse. It was so bad that sometimes Mrs. Cohen could hear it through the closed door of the cellar. One night, as Mrs. Cohen stood at the top of the stairs and listened to the alarming sound, she got an idea. She went to the telephone and made a call. The following evening, as Lisa was playing a lyrical passage from the Pantanique, she heard a knock at the door. It opened slightly, and a familiar face poked through the opening. "Lisa, may I come in?" said Mrs. Canfield. "Oh, hello," Lisa said, surprised. "Yes, please come down." Mrs. Canfield stepped carefully down the stairs, followed by Johnny, who was carrying a small, old-fashioned coal-burning stove. Lisa recognized it from the house on Riffle Road. "I can't accept this," Lisa protested. "Nonsense," said the Quaker lady. "You'll catch your death down here." "What will you use at home?" "I have plenty of jumpers and coats. I don't need it." "I really appreciate it, but I can't," Lisa insisted. "You can, and you will," Mrs. Canfield said with an unyielding tone. Lisa finally relented. "Thank you," she said gratefully. She hadn't wanted to admit how weak she had been feeling of late, and the warmth certainly would help. Johnny lit the stove, and when he was sure it was functioning properly, stood up and handed her a folded sheet of paper. She opened it quickly, saw it was a poem, and smiled. "Thank you, Johnny. I'll keep it on the piano to inspire me." "Be well, be warm," Johnny called out on his way back upstairs. "Would thee mind if I stayed and listened?" Mrs. Canfield asked. "Oh, yes, please do," Lisa replied. Mrs. Canfield pulled out the knitting bag she had brought, leaned back in her chair, and smiled. "Lisa, what a comfort your beautiful music is." An hour later, earlier than usual, the air raid siren went off. Mrs. Canfield stayed and listened to Lisa scare away the bombers with her chords. Usually, the all clear siren would sound several hours later, but this night was an exception. Hour after hour, the scream of the bombers came over them. No amount of pounding from the basement could chase the noise away. Lisa began to cough, and it couldn't stop, so she huddled by the stove under the blanket next to Mrs. Canfield, who put her arm around her. Suddenly tired of being brave all the time, Lisa began to cry. "What is wrong, my dear?" Mrs. Canfield asked. "Sometimes I miss my family so much that I feel like I couldn't go on. I can't go on without them. I don't even know why I should go on without them." Mrs. Canfield hugged the trembling girl tight. "It's not for thee to decide," she said. "Ultimately, God is in charge of our world. We have been placed here to do His will. I believe it is His will for thee to play your music. I hear a great truth in it. My mother told me to always hold on to my music. You must go forward with that in your heart, Lisa. Listen to your beloved mother." Finally, the all clear blared, and Mrs. Canfield looked at her watch. It was 5 in the morning. She helped Lisa up the stairs, and they walked out of the hostel into bitter cold dawn. Willesden Lane had been spared, but it seemed as though the rest of London was burning. Were the Nazis coming? Lisa wondered in a sudden delirium. She felt herself go limp. The next thing she remembered was waking up in her bunk bed. Gina handed her a hot cup of chicken soup. "You're awake! You're awake! Oh, Lisa, we were so worried!" Gina cried and ran out to spread the word. Mrs. Cohen arrived upstairs in an instant. "You gave us quite a fright, dear," she said with a slightly scolding tone. "The doctor has confined you to bed for the rest of the next week. He says you have a bad bronchitis." "A what?" Lisa cried with an alarm, not understanding the word. "Bronchitis, a very bad cough. You're not to get up." "But I have to practice," Lisa said. "Not until you're better. That's an order." Gina was anxious to get her turn. She wanted to tell Lisa everything that was going on. "You've been asleep for 2 whole days. You've missed everything," she blurted out. "Gina," Mrs. Cohen interrupted, "let Lisa rest, please." "No, Mrs. Cohen, I want to know what's going on. Have the Nazis come?" she asked fearfully. "The Nazis? No, silly. The Yanks are coming. You slept through the bombing of Pearl Harbor." "Pearl what?" Lisa asked, totally confused. "The Americans have joined the war," the matron explained. "We'll tell you all about it later, dear." Suddenly, Gina hung her head and started to cry. "What's wrong? Please tell me," Lisa asked. "Hush, Gina. We must let Lisa rest," said Mrs. Cohen. "It's Johnny," Gina said, paying no attention to the matron. "Johnny, what happened?" "Gina!" Mrs. Cohen repeated sternly. "Please tell me. Is he dead?" Lisa whispered. "He's been badly hurt. A wall gave way in a building where he was helping to put out a fire. He is fighting bravely in the hospital and wants to be remembered to all of us, and to you especially, Lisa," Mrs. Cohen explained. "He may lose his legs, though," Gina added sadly. Tears streamed from Lisa's eyes. "Oh, no! Can I go see him?" she asked. "You are not to get out of bed," the matron said firmly. Lisa turned away from them to control her emotions. "What a terrible thing this war is," she thought as she prayed for her friend.